Much, Tom, and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. I hope you're going to get a lot out of this session and hopefully learn a bit more about how we can support you and help you. So I'm Ahmad, I'm the founder and CEO of EmployAbility. I set this up about 15 years ago, and we work with lots and lots of universities to support students with disability and neurodiversity, excuse me, to help them into employment in that transition from education to employment. I know it's an area that many people worry about, and we're really here to support you and to provide that support to you. And so, please do reach out, please do register with us after the session if you haven't already done so, and you'll be able to see ways in which we can actually support you, but I'll talk through that today as well. Today's session, however, is all about neurodiversity, breaking down invisible barriers, and I'll go through what neurodiversity is, what invisible barriers look like, and how you navigate those. But before I do that, I want to just introduce my colleague here today as well, Kirsty. Kirsty, go ahead.
Hi, Tab. My name is Kirsty, and essentially I'm here to help with the liaison. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. I will put it into the chat, and I'll just answer any questions and direct them to anybody on our team. I'm also here to help you today. If there's any questions and things like that, I'll be able to answer some of them while we're going along. Obviously, interrupt Tab if necessary. And obviously looking forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, so please do feel free to put questions in the chat, as Kirsty said. She'll, at the relevant points, put those to me, and there'll also be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, have those answered as well. Or if you feel comfortable to unmute yourselves, then you can do that as well, whichever you're more comfortable. And I'm happy to take questions as we go through the session if you want to ask as well. Okay, so invisible barriers, what does that mean and what are we talking about here? Well, as I said, the session today is really going to be about broken down into three areas. In the first part, I'll take a look at what we mean by neurodiversity. And it's likely that if you're attending this session, you might already know that, you might already know if the condition you've got is a neurodiversity, but just for completion, I'll keep that section brief. Moving on from that, I'm going to have a look at what's really more central to what I want you to learn today. So it's about getting an understanding of what sorts of barriers might you face when you're actually applying to opportunities, and it's crucial that you have a really clear understanding as we go along of what the solutions to these barriers are. And we look at the different barriers that there are and the different solutions to those to help you to actually navigate those barriers. And just adding here that we are specialists in providing adjustments advice as well. We've got decades of experience of doing that. We have a whole team that does that on a day in, day out basis with hundreds of candidates and certainly thousands of candidates every year. So sometimes there might be things that you're not sure what the solution might be. There might be adjustments that may be possible for you, but that you might not be sure what those look like, and these may be different from those which you've received at university, or how to access those, and that's all things that we can actually help with. So our service to you is free. You can register, and once you've registered, you have to reach out proactively if you've got questions or if you want certain support. We won't automatically contact you just because you've registered with us, because we get thousands of applicants registering every day. But if you do register and you want some support and you want some guidance, then you can reach out to our student and adjustments team, and they will support you with that. So let's have a look at neurodiversity. It's a term that's become more and more popular over the last few years, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this term. And it's about the neurological differences, normal part of variation of brain types. It's lifelong, it's a broad spectrum of conditions, and neurological differences suggest that there is no cause as such, rather that those differences have always existed with neurodiverse conditions, so things like autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, dyscalculia, Tourette's, and a whole host of others. Normal meaning that neurodiversity is normal is a key piece in the shift in the way people are actually really thinking about this these days, and realizing that the difference is not a deficiency. In some people, it's a real strength. And can be very, very powerful. So also making the most of that difference if you do have one of these conditions, but also society accepting that this is just normal differences in our brain types, if you like. There is no cure It doesn't require curing, and conditions, of course, can coexist as well. So you sometimes get somebody with autism who might also have ADHD or dyslexia and ADHD. You can get any variation, combination of those different conditions coexisting. Thought I'd share with you something that we found quite interesting. So we had a recent look at some data from our own candidates, and we have about 15,000 candidates in our database. And when we looked at people who had reached at least second round of interview with the employers we work with, now typically these employers are people like Google, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bloomberg, big law firms, etc. So, pretty difficult employers to get onto international graduate programs with. When we looked at people who get to at least second round of interview with one of the employers that we partner with, we found that over 50% of those candidates, those students, had a neurodiversity, a neurodiverse condition. And then when we looked at people with mental health, that was about another 15% or so. So it was quite interesting that over sort of 65 or about 65% of students that we work with have either neurodiversity or mental health condition. And if you look at that purple segment there, about another 10% or so of 2 or more conditions, that is very likely to have people with neurodiversity and something else. Of course, there could be other things there as well. But we're probably looking at somewhere between 70% of our candidates who might have a neurodiversity. So I just wanted to share that with you because you can see how big this is, how many people at university have a neurodiverse condition. And it's probably the biggest group of disabilities that are disclosed at university for which people seek support. And though sometimes we meet students who will say to us things like, well, I only have dyslexia, that's not really a disability, is it? It's really important for you to know that all of those conditions that I've mentioned, including dyslexia, all of those conditions I've mentioned are, for legal purposes under the Equality Act, defined as a disability. So if you have one of these conditions, that it is a disability, and it means you can get support. It means you have a right to adjustments. And I think it's just very important for you to know and understand that. And it's not something for which you have to make an apology. None of these things impact your intelligence, but they may impact how you do things and what can be helpful. So of course, that's the purpose of adjustments, to help you to perform to your best ability, but with the right support in place, to which in law, you have a right. And more and more companies are being inclusive and want to be inclusive because they want to make sure they have a diverse workforce. It helps their business, but also they want to do the right thing. They are making the right adjustments for people to be able to perform to their best ability. So just want you to keep that at the back of your head as we go through the session. Now, I mentioned very quickly that I would just quickly talk through the different conditions that I've mentioned. So autism, which can be about difficulty of building social relationships. It can be difficulty interpreting verbal or non-verbal communication, body language, and so on. And there can be a preference for things like structures and routines. And in terms of adjustments, when we go through these, you'll see there's plenty of adjustments that are possible if you have autism, for example. If you feel uncomfortable to have your screen on in remote interviews or remote meetings, and it's a reasonable adjustment to ask for you to ask to have your screen switched off and to communicate without the camera on. That's perfectly reasonable. If you find it difficult to make eye contact in interviews, as an example, it's perfectly reasonable. One of the things we would say to the employer would be something along the lines of, this person finds eye contact difficult, please don't use this against them, don't use it to gauge whether or not they're interested in the role. It doesn't mean they're not interested. So information like that, but of course we work with students on an individualized basis to inform you, or rather to discuss with you what adjustments you need, what's going to work for you, before you can then pass that on to the employer. ADHD, difficulty with organization, sometimes concentration, sometimes hyperactivity, impulsivity, and so on. Again, there's various adjustments, and we'll go through these later about what can be done to help you if you have ADHD going through a recruitment process. The key thing here is to really know what a recruitment process entails, so that when you're going through the recruitment process, we can discuss with you in detail what adjustments will be helpful for you for each stage of that recruitment process. Tourette syndrome, people often think this is to do with somebody shouting out a rude word, but that's a very limited number of people who have Tourette's actually have that particular symptom. It's often to do with tics and repeated movements and repetitive sounds, for example. And then dyslexia and dyspraxia, very similar effects. People with these have difficulty processing information, or they process information differently to other people, if you like. There can be difficulty processing information in the short-term memory. And of course, we know that many employers these days have psychometric tests, multiple choice tests, where you're required to process information in your short-term memory repeatedly. And we know that that can be problematic for anybody with neurodiversity, actually, perhaps particularly if you've got dyslexia or dyspraxia. Are there any questions?
None at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to look at the invisible barriers today. We said the invisible barriers to entry, and we've broken that down into the barrier within, which is really about imposter syndrome, which we come up against time and time again. The fear of need or acceptance of support is another sort of barrier within. The desire to not have a difference, viewing, not wanting to be treated differently from other people, perhaps wanting to be treated as everyone else. And then I think there's often a big thing that we come up against is the privacy part of it. So will my condition be shared with other people? What's going to be my privacy around this? And one of the things I really want you to take home with you today, if there's nothing else that you take home today, a really important piece of which we are very, very big advocates, is under the Equality Act. So this is what gives you protection if you have a disability when you're going through employment. Under the Equality Act, employers cannot ask you any details of your disability whilst you're going through the recruitment process. And this is really important because we know that sometimes employers do ask for things like educational psychologist reports, or they ask for medical evidence, but that is not lawful for them to do that. And there is a way to very politely tell them that you won't be providing that information, and also for reasons of privacy and GDPR rules as well. What is important for you to know, however, is that employers can ask you if you need adjustments, and it's, of course, they should be asking you if you need adjustments, and you can tell an employer what adjustments you need without disclosing to them what your disability is. So you are able to ask for adjustments without sharing personal information or even the name of your disability if you don't wish to share that. It's your privacy and it's your choice what personal information you share with an employer. We'll be looking also at disabling practices and environments, so barriers in the recruitment process, lack of support that might be offered as far as adjustments are concerned, and only prescribed and not individualized adjustments that are often sometimes offered by employers. So some employers have a list of certain adjustments. I sometimes hear, well, we only give 25%, but actually that's not lawful. They have to provide what is needed. They can't operate from a set of prescribed adjustments that they give. It has to be based upon the individual in front of them. And then others' attitudes, so people's perceptions about your particular disability, misconceptions, assumptions based on very, very limited knowledge. So we'll look at those. So let's go through those now. So in terms of the barriers within, I'd say the first one can be confidence. And some of these may resonate with some of you, all of these, there might be some that don't resonate with you, but do feel free to put in the chat if any of this is resonating with you, or if you have any comments to make, do feel free to put that in the chat. Just so you know, only the hosts can see the chat as far as I'm aware, so don't worry about if you want to put something in there, even if it's confidential. We're not going to share something unless you want us to share that, but let us know if you don't want us to share something. And in any case, we're not sharing names of who's put something once we ask the question either, so feel free to put something if you'd like to in the chat if you've got any questions. So confidence, so students can sometimes feel that their neurodiversity means that they may not be able to do certain types of roles or join certain organizations. You might feel that whilst you can manage in education, an environment where you're feeling supported and where adjustments are made for you, that's great, and you've been finding that environment, but you might feel much less comfortable joining a less structured environment or workplace that might, from the outside to you, feel very, very challenging because it's unfamiliar. You might be concerned that you won't be understood, that your adjustments won't be understood, they won't be put into place. Or you might feel that your particular condition means that that's going to make it hard for you to do certain types of roles. So as an example, I've had somebody with dyslexia from a top university with fantastic academic grades say to me, well, I probably can't apply to a law firm and be a lawyer because I've got dyslexia and they wouldn't want me. Now, I can tell you now that we have got plenty of examples of really successful dyslexic lawyers, ones who've joined top magic circle firms, basically, irrespective of dyslexia. So I think there are always adjustments that can be made, so don't make assumptions about things that you might not be able to do, and you have to sort of get over that internal barrier, if you like, yourself. If you're interested in a particular area, apply for it, and there will for sure be adjustments that can be made to help you to actually perform as well as you can. Of course, you have to have the right skill set, but it's really important not to confuse your disability with skill set. Or maybe you're not concerned about your own internal barriers, perhaps you're worried about what an employer might think if you tell them you have a certain condition. But again, remember, going through the recruitment process, you don't have to tell the employer anything that you're not comfortable to tell them, but you can still ask for the adjustments that you need. And finally, what I'd say on that is that, you know, more and more employers want to be inclusive, are trying to be inclusive, and you know, rather than seeing your condition as a negative, there might be ways in which you can see it as a positive in certain situations, and we'll talk about that shortly as well. So, for example, you might be able to see it as a positive in terms of a competency. If you have a disability, or if you have a neurological condition, and you that's made you more resilient. It's something you've had since birth. You've had to learn different coping strategies. Well, resilience is usually a very valued skill, a very valued competency as far as most employers are concerned. So that may be helpful in any case. So there might be ways you can actually turn something that you think might be negative into something very, very positive. Next, imposter syndrome. So neurodiverse students, I mentioned before, are often reluctant to ask for the support that they need compared to somebody, for example, with a physical disability. Of course, neurodiversities are non-visible typically, and therefore people don't know you have the condition or what support you need unless you ask for that. And sometimes people somehow feel that this is a lesser disability, that therefore they shouldn't be asking. There's some element of should. Oh, I shouldn't be needing that sort of support. I shouldn't be asking. Is that really fair to other people? As if it's somehow going to give you an unfair advantage. And here what I'd say is that you're not an imposter. First of all, your disability has an impact on you. Your neurodiversity is having an impact on you. 70%, as I said to you before, or more of disabilities are non-visible. And we looked at the numbers that you saw, that can very, very high numbers of people coming through us who have a neurodiverse condition. It's recognized in law, and for good reason. So just because you don't see something doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean that you don't need adjustments for it. And so it's really important that you ask for the adjustments you need. And EmployAbility will say confidently, unapologetically. So make sure you can ask for those adjustments confidently and unapologetically. There is nothing you need to be concerned about in terms of it not being a real thing for you to ask the adjustments. It's real for you, and if you need adjustments, you need adjustments. Next, there's sometimes an element of guilt about the idea of imposing yourself on somebody, upon an employer, that the burden the employer feels, or that if you get the adjustment, it might be unfair to others. So remember, it's not about giving you an unfair advantage. It's about leveling the playing field. If the playing field is here and you're down here because of your condition, it's just about doing this. It's not about putting you up here. So don't worry about the fairness for other people or not. It's about what's fair for you to get that level playing field. And it's not a burden as far as employers are concerned, it's your right. Then we've got lack of knowledge. So there can be a great deal of confusion about what you have to tell an employer. We've talked about this already. And just again, to just reiterate that, you don't have to tell an employer about your disability in order to get the adjustments that you need, and that's outlined in section 60 of the Equality Act. So that section specifically spells out you don't tell an employer about the disability you have in order to get the adjustments, and employers can't ask you any questions about it apart from what adjustments do you need. So when you're applying to an employer, rather than telling them the condition that you have, it's much more relevant to tell them what adjustments you need. Telling them the condition that you have isn't necessarily going to let them know what adjustments you need. One, because they're not adjustments experts. Two, even if they were, the adjustments you need might be very different from that which somebody else with exactly the same condition might need. So think of this in terms of what adjustments you need, and that's the relevant bit to share with the employers, that they can give you those adjustments going through the recruitment process. If you get offered a role, once you get offered a role, an employer can lawfully at that point ask you what the condition is and seek more information around that. And that's because the duty on the employer becomes much bigger, much heavier at that point to make sure they make the right adjustments for the workplace. So once they offer you a role, an employer is then entitled to ask you what adjustments you need. Of course, it's still up to you what amount of information you want to share. But during the recruitment process, they shouldn't be asking you that information. And finally, I just want to say a word about mental health conditions. So many people with neurodiversity may also have mental health condition. I talked about this a bit earlier. Sometimes a result of undiagnosed neurodiversity, or sometimes as a result of neurodiversity itself, anxiety around it, and so on. The mental health condition itself can become a disability and an additional barrier, and that you might also then need other adjustments because of your mental health condition. So when we talk to you about adjustments, it's about you as a whole person, whatever's impacting, whether it's neurodiversity, whether it's mental health, and we'll make sure that you get the right adjustments and advise you on what those can look like for however you are impacted as the individual. Are there any questions?
No, there's nothing at the moment.
Great, thank you. So we've looked at invisible barriers, the barriers within, and next I want to take a look at disabling practices and environments. And the first of these is about rigid entry criteria. So some organizations have strict criteria in place before they will consider you as a candidate. For example, they might require consistently high grades throughout education or university. They might expect you to have had work experience or access to work experience, extracurricular activities, or a certain expectation of how long it might have taken you to complete your degree, for example. And you might have been impacted on all of these things because of a late diagnosis, or because of not having the right support in place, or because of lack of knowledge of what adjustments you could have received. So it's really important that in this case, the adjustment we ask organizations to make, we ask recruiters to make, is one of adjusting their screening criteria. So one of the things we talk to employers about is if the profile of a candidate who applies to them looks different because of disability, then it's appropriate. The adjustment we're asking to make is one of attitudinal adjustment, to make sure that they're not holding that against you. And if that is the case for you, if any of these things that I've just spoken about do apply, it took you longer to complete a degree, you didn't get the grades you were expecting during a part of your education because you didn't have the right adjustments in place, those sorts of things, then it's really important that you ask for that adjustment on the application form or in a cover letter, wherever you can, but you let the employer know at that point, because at that point you are needing an adjustment, and the adjustment you're needing is one for the recruiter not to hold that against you. So when you think about adjustments, think about what's the point at which you need the adjustment to be made in order for you to be able to get through that part of the process. We've talked about this already a little bit, but another big disabling practice can be psychometric and other tests. We know specifically that these can be particularly problematic for people with neurodiversity, and many employers use these as gatepost tests these days. The reason is that there are a huge number of applications that many employers get, and they want to get these down to some sort of manageable number that they can then process. And one of the ways in which they do that is by having these gatepost tests, these psychometric tests right at the beginning, for you to take, and that sifts out a large number of people, and there's far fewer people left for them to put through the rest of the process. Now, so it's understandable why they do it from a practical sense. However, employers do appreciate these tests in particular can be very, very difficult for a lot of people with different neurodiverse conditions. These can be, sometimes these are personality tests, sometimes these are situational judgment tests. Sometimes these are numerical reasoning tests, logical reasoning tests of all different types, and they can cause different problems for different people with different conditions. So if, for example, you are impacted by your particular neurodiverse condition, and that means it's going to make any of these kinds of tests challenging for you. Of course, first of all, you have to know what tests they're going to be asking you to do. Then we can have a conversation with you about the appropriate adjustment. Now, I know that for university, a lot of you get 25% extra time, which is a fairly standard amount of extra time at university for long essay-based or long 3-hour exams. But sometimes that time adjustment is not relevant or appropriate for psychometric multiple choice based testing of this nature. So it might be that you need more than 25% extra time. It might be in extreme cases that you might need you might need an exemption from actually doing the test. So whatever that looks like for you, we'll have detailed discussions with you that will mean that we can talk to you about the appropriate adjustment that you might need for tests of this nature. So really important to think about what's going to be the nature of the test or the exercise that you're going to need to engage in as part of the recruitment process. So the more information you can find out about that ahead of having to engage in it, the better it is, because then you can talk to us and we can talk to you about what sorts of adjustments might be relevant for you to engage effectively in that part of the process and do as well as you can. In terms of interviews and assessment exercises, again, there's a number of which interviews can be barriers, might be barriers. If you have to do a presentation, for example, if you find eye contact difficult, we talked about that. These days, if you find virtual interviews difficult. But again, the format of interviews can be changed. There are adjustments that can be made to the interview, to the exercise you might have to engage in a similar way to the test as well. So whether that means doing something different, if you can't, for example, if you find it difficult participating in a group exercise, as an example, because of your condition, then those things can be changed and different assessments can be put in place for you to level that playing field. So again, find out exactly what the interview process looks like, and as part of the interview, are there any tests as part of the interview? What different elements does that interview contain? And similarly for assessment exercises, and then we can work with you and talk to you about what will be the relevant adjustments for you for those. And lastly, looking at non-adapted working environments as a possible barrier. So once you're actually in a role, there might be other challenges, and I know many people can worry about these things which neurotypical workers are unaffected by or might even be having to think about. So for example, being provided with inaccessible instructions. Sometimes employers, when you join an organization, provide you with, you've taken lots and lots of information, and taking in lots and lots of verbal information can be difficult to retain. So one of the adjustments that might be very helpful, one of the things we tell employers, is actually making sure they provide any verbal instructions, long list of verbal instructions in written bullet point format as well. And that means you have that as a reference that you can then use later on. Other sorts of things can be things like unexpected changes to a project or working day or your structure. And to some extent, we have to accept that unexpected things can happen in business, but one of the adjustments we tell employers to make, if that's going to be difficult for somebody, if there's an unexpected change, is to give as much notice as possible, for example. So these are workplace adjustments, and once you get offered a role, we can then have a separate and different conversation with you about workplace adjustments. Just one other thing I wanted to mention to you about all of this is that when we're talking to employers about the adjustments you need in the recruitment process, one of the things we particularly tell them to do is to make sure that they only use those as adjustments for the recruitment process, and they don't extrapolate that information or make assumptions from that information about what your workplace adjustments would be should you get an offer. And we let them know explicitly that we'll have that conversation with you once you get an offer, and then talk to them about workplace adjustments. So in your head, I think, keep really clear that the adjustments you have going through a recruitment process may or may not have anything to do with what workplace adjustments you may need. You might need additional adjustments in the workplace. You might need different adjustments in the workplace, and that's okay. So I'd look at this as sort of steps at a time. As far as recruitment process is concerned, again, break that down to the application. What's relevant? Do you need an adjustment at that point? If you need an attitudinal adjustment because of grades or difference in profile that we talked about, then ask for it there. If you don't need an adjustment there at that point, there's nothing to ask for until you get to the next stage. Maybe you get to the stage of where there's online psychometric tests, maybe you need an adjustment there, in which case let's determine what those are, and then you can ask for those. If you don't need any adjustments for that, but you won't need an adjustment until you get to doing a presentation and assessment day, that's okay too. So break it down into bits and ask for the adjustment at the point when you find out you have to engage in that next process. Then you can have the discussion with us and we can tell you and work with you about what adjustments might be beneficial. You don't have to tell the employer about the adjustments for the entire process right at the beginning. I would do it on a step-by-step basis. And finally, looking at invisible barriers, I want to have a look at others' attitudes. And the first of these is ignorance of the law. So the Equality Act is a very powerful piece of legislation. I've already mentioned that potential employers are not allowed to ask any health or disability-related questions during recruitment, except whether you require adjustment, where you require adjustments. But your protections go further than this. They go beyond this. They're not allowed to ask you, as we've discussed before, to show evidence, to show proof of your disability, or ask for educational psychologist reports. It doesn't mean they don't. They do sometimes ask for those, often because they're not completely familiar with that part of the law. They don't know that that's an unlawful thing to do. And equally, they're not allowed to ask you if you need adjustments to the work itself. So really important that you know what your rights are. Of course, if you choose to share certain information about your disability or anything like that, that's absolutely your right to do that, but they're not lawfully allowed to ask that information from you. So hopefully after this session, you will know what your rights are and that it's your privacy, and therefore it's your choice what you choose to tell an employer during the recruitment process. Secondly, discrimination. Again, the Equality Act provisions we've spoken about minimize the impact of discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious. So however discrimination exists, sometimes without malicious intent, that can happen, but the fact of asking for adjustments can cause an employer to draw conclusions about the nature of the underlying condition and whether or not a candidate can do a job. And that fear can often mean that people don't ask for the adjustments they need, and that fear in and of itself can feel like a barrier. So you might be worrying about that, but I think what we want you to rest assured about is asking for adjustments is your right, and reputable employers won't discriminate. So make an assumption, if you like, take a leap of faith that reputable employers won't discriminate. And if an employer does discriminate, we can then have a different conversation about what you can do with that, what you might want to do with that. And one of the things you might want to do with that is choose not to work for that employer, for example, but you may also have legal remedies if you wanted to go down that route. Thirdly, others' attitudes can be impacted by ignorance about neurodiversity. So there's a lack of understanding sometimes around how differently each person's condition can impact them. There can be an assumption that one person with dyslexia will be impacted in the same way as the next person with dyslexia. And so then employers can sometimes think about, well, one adjustment can work for another for the next person that comes along. So there's that element. Secondly, there can be assumptions made about how people with different neurodiverse conditions are impacted, and then sometimes employers can draw conclusions from that about what somebody can or can't do. So it's really important that you ask for the adjustments that are specific to you and what you need. A lot of the work that we do with employers in the background, of course, is educating employers on things like how people are impacted, what sorts of adjustments and so on. So you can also rest assured that there is background work that goes on as well, certainly with the organisations that we partner with, but many inclusive employers are engaging in educating themselves as well about this, so that they don't draw wrong conclusions about people's abilities. And sometimes there can be ignorance about neurodiversity. There can be assumptions, wrong interpretations. There's no one size fits all, and partly what I was just talking about earlier. So as we talked about, 25% might not be a relevant adjustment for you, even though you've had that at university, even though it might be relevant for somebody else, going through the recruitment process may not be the same for you. So it's about making sure you choose the right strategy, that you get the right adjustment, and including the attitudinal adjustments as well. So if there's are there any questions, Kirsty, at all?
There was one, but it was a direct message, and it probably could be voiced in a way that it is quite relevant. So that is one of the participants struggles with building contacts, and therefore they struggle to get diverse experiences. And it was more, I suppose, in applying for a job, how do we have any tips for this? Because obviously their world is smaller than what it would be normally. So because they can't build contacts as easily, and obviously how could employability therefore help with that sort of issue?
Yeah, so I think this has been hard for everybody, obviously for every student in over the last year in particular, not helped by COVID. And I think that building contacts has become a lot harder. So I think at the moment, one of the ways in which people are doing that is through things like LinkedIn, for example, Twitter, or sometimes Facebook groups. I would sort of find out lots of if you're trying to connect with individuals who might be going through a similar experience, there's various groups around for that. But also if you're trying to connect with various recruiters, for example, lots of them are on things like LinkedIn. You can connect with them there, you can message them there. Make sure if you're going to be using LinkedIn, however, that your profile is very professional, because LinkedIn is specifically a professional site. That's the purpose of it, unlike Facebook, for example, which is much more social. So make sure that you have the right image, that you're using the right words to present yourself on LinkedIn. And if you need any support and guidance with that, I'm sure perhaps somebody at university can provide that, or maybe you can seek that out elsewhere. In terms of how employability can directly help, we are still running, for example, things like insight days with many of the employers that we work with. Of course, they're happening virtually at the moment, so that all that opportunity we used to have, at the end of an insight day session where you'd have networking, chance to meet people from different employers. Of course, that's different, and it's done in a different way these days. So just to give you some examples, we had some insight days over this last year with different employer partners we work with. Breakout rooms, and different members of the employer's team came to different breakout rooms. You had a chance to meet them, ask them questions in a smaller settings in the breakout rooms. So there are ways of doing it, but of course it is different. So I think it's just about thinking about the different ways. So I would use things like LinkedIn, things like Twitter, follow people, etc., things like Facebook. Look out for groups, maybe even student groups, maybe even at your university as well, where you can be part of a society or communicate with people through social media, for example, which seems to be the way we're all doing things remotely at the moment. But also you can attend events, things like insight days. So do look on our website. We'll have a whole host of them coming up from September. And so, keep looking on our website to see what sorts of events like that are coming up and how you can interact. And then, of course, once you attend one of these events, you can do things like ask other students who are on there how you can share information, how you can get information, or ask recruiters who are on there or individuals from the firm who are on there if you can connect with them, for example, through LinkedIn or in other ways, and build your network that way. And finally, I'd just say that everybody's in the same boat. It's difficult. The ways in which we're doing things remotely nowadays makes it difficult for everybody. So, in that sense, it's the same for everyone. It is tougher, and I appreciate if you have a neurodiversity, that might make it even harder. Or it may, for some of you, it may make it easier. I don't know, but some of those ways that I've said, but just mentioned, I think would be good ways to try and connect and build that network.
We have another question, Tab. In terms of supporting candidates after they've successfully got a job, does employability provide in-work support and advocacy?
Does employability provide, sorry, Kirsty, I can hardly hear you. For some reason, it's very hard for me to hear on my computer today, sorry.
Does EmployAbility provide in-work support and advocacy?
Does employers provide in-work support?
Yes, once they have a job.
Oh, I see. So yes, it depends. So for example, if you're applying to one of our partner employers, then for sure, yes, we do, because we will have an arrangement with that particular employer to make sure that we can provide you with the advice for the adjustments you need in employment. If you're going to an employer that we're not partnering with, then that would really be down to that employer of how they wanted to use us, or to provide that support to you, or maybe they use somebody else, for example. But look, if you're one of our candidates, we're always available to speak to you. You know, we have a really extensive alumni network. We have many candidates of ours who placed years ago that we're still in contact with, still speak to, have a relationship with. Once you register with us, it's really up to you what relationship you want to build with us. But you know, we maintain our relationships, we support in whatever way that we can. So, you know, it would really be on a case-by-case basis, and we'd speak to you about that. But, you know, we're a not-for-profit, so everything we do goes back into the pot to help and support our beneficiary group is neurodiverse and disabled students and graduates, to support them. But of course, we're also a business, so we have to keep that in mind as well. And we don't get trust funding, government funding, etc. The only funding we get is, as any business, is for the services we provide to employers. So they pay us for that service because they're benefiting from that, and to some extent services we provide to universities. But really it's up to you how you use us and how you build a relationship with us, and we will support you in whatever way we can, even once you get employment, if we're able to do that.
On that exact point, Tab, we have a question. Do we have within EmployAbility, within its leadership structure, neurodiverse leaders or stakeholders in order to give authentic understanding and advocacy?
So the answer to that is yes, we do. We have members of the team who have neurodiverse conditions, or they're very close to family members who have neurodiverse conditions. So the answer to that is yes, and the advice we give is always authentic. We come at it from the perspective of personal experience, but also years of professional experience as well. I've been in this space for some, I'd say 20 years now. You know, I have close family members with a neurodiverse condition. I myself have a mental health condition, and similarly for other members of the team as well.
And I think you've also just answered this one, but is EmployAbility privately or government funded? Or
it's not government funded, to answer your question. We are an independent, not-for-profit organisation. We don't get any government funding or trust funding at all. So, you know, we operate like any other business. We have to be a going concern in order to exist, but any income we get comes from our partnerships with employers, and more recently, in the last few years, our partnerships with universities. Okay, so I'm going to, in the interest of time, move forward, because just to make sure we can finish this session off. So I mentioned that I would talk to you about adjustments, and some of the sorts of adjustments that are helpful for some people are things like sometimes exemptions or different amount of time that an employer might than 25%, for example. Things like rest breaks can be helpful, particularly if you have a series of interviews or one particularly long interview or session. That can be helpful. Getting instructions in bullet point format, which I spoke to you about earlier as well. And then things like sometimes the instructions we give to interviewers is to ask clear and concise questions, for example, making sure they're not asking multi-part questions, perhaps breaking those down into single questions can be helpful as well. And then things like having your camera switched off at times may be helpful to some people. Adjustments of perception that we can ask sometimes employers to make is not to make assumptions about what somebody can or can't do based upon their own limited knowledge. To ensure that if somebody's energy levels appear to be low, or somebody's presenting differently, if somebody doesn't sound excited, doesn't mean they're necessarily not excited about the role. It might just mean that they aren't conveying that to you as the interviewer. And that can also happen because of mental health reasons as well. Sometimes somebody may not sound as enthusiastic as an interviewer may be expecting. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not interested in the role. To Disregard interruptions. So sometimes people with neurodiverse conditions may interrupt if you have ADHD, for example, but also sometimes people with dyspraxia, they need to get something out before they'll forget it. So again, not to hold that against the person being interviewed as well. And to adjust their screening criteria, which we discussed if your profile looks different. And finally, I want to sort of just finish off with neurodiversity as a positive. So you can use neurodiversity evidence, as I mentioned before, a skill or a competency. I mentioned resilience, for example, and other competencies that you can use to evidence that you have that competency. I wouldn't use it for every competency example, but it's all right to use it once, I'd say, to evidence a specific competency. As always, if you're using it to illustrate a competency, you have to think about the STAR technique, think about how you're going to use it to demonstrate the competency. So think about the situation, the task or actions you had to take, how you use that. So whatever you're using to evidence a competency, you still have to kind of use the same format as you would with any other example you were giving. It might be to access disability positive schemes. So for example, you might have seen the disability confidence symbol that some employers have, which means that if you meet the minimum criteria of that organization, then they'll offer you an interview. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll offer you the job, but it means they can offer you the interview. However, for a lot of employers who have multi-part application process, recruitment process, I'm not sure how relevant that is, because it's not about just offering you the interview. You might have to jump through several hoops before you can get to the interview part of that. But in some cases, for example, I know with the civil service, if you apply to them, if you tell them you have a disability, you can skip certain parts of the recruitment process. So it may be to your advantage, for example, to access certain schemes. I know there's a lot of schemes around for neurodiversity or autism specific schemes, and again, in order to get onto those, you will need to let them know that that's the condition you have in order to access that particular scheme. So it may be to your benefit in some cases. And finally, we've talked a lot about profile difference. I'm not going to go into that again, but finally, you might be wanting to check, is the employer inclusive? If you're comfortable talking about your condition, or even if you're not, but you simply ask for adjustments, that can often give you a really good clue by the employer's response as to whether or not they're actually an inclusive employer. And that gives you more information with which to assess the employer and about whether or not you're interested in working for them. So are they positive about being inclusive? Are they positive about difference? So that gives you more information and something for you to think about as well when you're assessing the employer and whether they're suitable for you. And so that brings me to the end of my session, and happy to take any further questions, or I don't know, Tom, if you would like to make any comments.
There is a question. What is an example of a competency that you can support with neurodiversity?
Well, I mentioned one, which is resilience, for sure, I'd say. That's often a competency that's sought out by most employers, by a lot of employers. I'm trying to think of what others there might be. So I don't know, Kirsty or Tom, if you can think of any. I'm just trying to think of what other sort of competencies. I mean, it could be any competency, really. Sorry, Kirsty.
I was going to say sometimes you can break down a problem quicker because you have ADHD. Problem solving skills. Problem solving, exactly. So, and in fact, Claire has thought of that one as well. So yeah, there's a lot of things that actually go in your favour if you have neurodiverse issues, obviously, or an awareness of it is simply just sometimes enough.
I think yes. Thanks, Kirsty. And I think also when you're thinking about this, I think rather than trying to fit your condition to the competency, I'd think of it more the other way around. If you come across a competency, try and think, okay, well, what's the best example that I can think of to demonstrate this competency? And then you might think, oh, actually, this particular thing that I've had to do, I've had to learn because of my neurodiverse condition, like problem solving or like resilience, for example. And you can think, actually, yes, of course, that's something other people won't have as an example because they haven't had to encounter that in the same way. And look, if you've got a neurodiversity, there'll be things that you've been used to doing from a really young age because you've had it since birth. And maybe some things that you take for granted. So it might be worth sitting down and making a list or thinking through what things have you learned as a result of your neurodiversity. It might be worth just listing those out. What sorts of things, what do you do that maybe you take for granted because you've always had to do it? or you do quite automatically, but have a sit down and think, what are the things that I've learned? What are things that I do that other people don't have to do, that other people don't have to figure out? And that might then give you some clues when you come to answer competency questions about what might be relevant to use.
We do have another question along those same sort of lines. Somebody has 2 diagnoses of long-term mental health issues, but they're in a very long waiting line at the NHS, and therefore can they ask for adjustments that are more like autism and ADHD, and put them in rather than obviously the ones that are undiagnosed at the moment? I think it's more to do with the fact that they're waiting for a diagnosis.
Okay.
And can they basically ask for all adjustments that are similar to their diagnosis when they get it?
Yes, so that's a really good question, actually. So what I'd say there is that if you think you need adjustments because you're having difficulties in a particular way, then I would for sure ask for the adjustment. And yes, you can, and I think you should. Remember that employers lawfully aren't allowed to ask you for proof. So an employer can't say to you, prove it, prove that you have this disability. They can't ask you for proof. So if you simply say, you don't have to say, I've got this disability, therefore I need these adjustments. You simply have to say, I have a disability and I need these adjustments. That's all you have to say. Or I will need adjustments in the recruitment process, and tell them what those are. Now we can kind of work with you to kind of talk to you about how you can put those across in a way, in a series of instructions to the employer, a series of do's and don'ts that will be helpful for you, so that their interviewers, their recruiters know what to do in order to make those adjustments. So you need to give enough information for them to make the appropriate adjustment, but you don't need to give any information about your disability in order to get the adjustment. So I wouldn't worry too much about the medical diagnosis. If you're waiting to find out, it doesn't matter. You can still ask for the adjustments that you need, and we can help you to understand what those might look like. Now, I know that currently, as far as I'm aware, Newcastle is considering becoming one of our Next Generation Inclusive University partners. And once that happens, we will also be able to advocate on your behalf to employers as well, employers other than the ones who partner with us. Of course, if you apply to one of the employers we already partner with, then we will support you and advocate on your behalf. So we'll not only have the discussion with you about the adjustments you need, but we will also speak to the employer to let them know what those adjustments are, so that you don't have to, and we can take that stress, that anxiety away for you, so you can just go along with the right adjustments in place and perform to your best ability.
Tab, there is one question that I don't think that we have answered. Do you know of any skills audits that may be relevant for people with a neurodiversity?
Sorry, Kirsty, any skills?
Audits that may be relevant for people with a neurodiversity.
Skills audits?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question. I must admit, perhaps that particular
person. From me. Sorry,
Thomas.
I have my careers service hat on.
Yes.
The reason that I thought of that is because we have, obviously, as a service, we've got so many resources that students can access in order to sort of to get that to figure out themselves through a skills audit what their where their strengths lie. And I wondered if there was anything sort of specifically either designed by EmployAbility or elsewhere that you might know of that might be really useful for our students to sort of help them reflect on their own skills and figure that out for themselves through a skills audit.
We don't have anything specific like that. We do run sessions, however, on how to do well at interviews or how to write a good application form. We do run webinars on that sort of thing, which any student who's registered with us can join, and we do then sometimes go through how to think about how best to answer questions in the application form, how best to think about your skill set, what are the different areas of your life you need to think about. I mean, just to answer that question in short form, Tom, we don't have anything that we can send through to you, but I could just say one of the very useful things to do is to, if you're a student listening, one of the very useful things to do is to break your life down into different segments. So, you know, school, perhaps secondary school, university, and then break those things down further into academic, societies, extracurricular, sports, etc. And underneath all of those, write down what you've done, what are the sorts of things you've done. And once you've done that, you can then start thinking about what skills in each of those things that you've done could apply to that. So that's often a really good way of sort of almost drawing a tree diagram, a really good way of sort of thinking about splitting your life out into different sections and different things within each of those sections to then really think about what skills have I acquired during that time, because it can be really easy to forget as well. And for most of you who are students, certainly if you're, you know, let's say if you're in your early 20s, for example, it's fine to refer to something you did at school. It's not that long ago that happened. It's okay to talk about that and the skills you've learned. It's okay to talk about a summer job that you've done, for example. So don't make assumptions about that a skill has to look like or come from a particular area. You know, you can learn work experience from anywhere. You can have done it through traveling. You might have had to negotiate certain things. You might have had to plan in certain ways, for example. So think about different things that you've done and don't think it has to come from traditional things that you've done in order to show or illustrate that competency or that skill. So I don't know if that's helpful, Tom.
That's great. Thank you so much. I do just have one more. I'm sorry we've run over a little bit, but it's been absolutely fascinating. So I hope everyone doesn't mind just a few extra minutes. Just as you know, the purpose of this week from our point of view is to help these guys who may still be looking for a graduate job, you know, help them secure one now. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you partner with companies and how you then advertise on their behalf on My Career, on our online portal, so that these students can go away immediately and find some vacancies that are advertising, right?
Of course. So we partner with many different employers, some of which I mentioned, the likes of Google, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bloomberg, Amazon, various others, law firms and consultancies and so on. So the best thing to do is you have to keep a really close eye on our website, but we do also post these particular roles with employers, whether it's for an internship or a graduate program or an insight day or a first year program, whatever employer programs are working with them on that are relevant to early careers, i.e. you guys, we post those on university career sites. So if you go onto university career sites, you'll see certain posts from us, and they're normally called, you know, it might be called Google Employability Internship Program, or sometimes it's Employability Google, but yeah, whichever way around it is, it will normally have the term employability in there. Not always, but very often, and you will know if it's a post from us. And if you click into that, it will take you to our website. The very first thing you have to do, if you haven't already done that, is to register with us. And so the other way around this, as soon as you come off this call, you can go onto our website, register, fill that out, and then that means that next time you want to apply for something, for a particular role, for an internship or a graduate role, an insight day, whatever it might be, you can then click on that application form for that particular employer, and that will take you to an application form for that employer, but only we see that. That's on our website. And if not, if you're taking you to an external site, we'll tell you click here and this will take you to their site, but usually that's on our website. It means we can support you with that application. So once you submit that application, we view it first, and if there's a competency question, for example, we can give you tips. Sometimes we send back tips and say, well, actually, look, how about thinking about it like this or answering it like this? We're not going to answer the question for you. We can give you some tips on how to improve your answers, for example. We can have further discussions with you if things like your profile looks different, your grades were impacted, and we can talk to you about how best to present that to the employer as well. If it's with one of our partner employers, we'll advocate all of that as well when we present your application to that employer. So once you've registered, you can apply to any of those roles through us, and we will support you in that application, particularly if it's with an employer that we are partnering with.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I've just popped a link there to EmployAbility's organisation profile on My Career. So you'll be able to see straight away the opportunities that they have available, etc. And as Tab says, you can link then out to their website and register in there as well. Just one last call out for any questions before I wrap up. No, great. Well, thank you, Tab. That was absolutely fantastic, really, really insightful. And I hope that you've all got a lot of really useful information from there, and a bit of an action plan as well on how you can take a lot of this advice forward now in your search for a graduate graduate role, or anything else that you might need this information for. I'm going to stop the recording just now. So
I was also, sorry, Tom, I was just going to mention that if any of you feel comfortable would like to post anything about the session on LinkedIn, please tag me, please tag EmployAbility, and use the hashtag #NextGenerationInclusiveThinking. We'd be delighted if you want to do that. Feel free to connect with me if you'd like to do that as well.
Brilliant. And Tab, would you mind popping your LinkedIn profile link into the chat before possible, or if
I'm just called Tab Ahmad on there, so if they just use that, and then EmployAbility on there is actually, I think it's called EmployAbility Limited on LinkedIn, so feel free to use those on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Great. I'm just